The name of this talk is Delivering the Impossible. It's a talk about project management and software development in particular. The idea of this talk is that I've come up with lots of different taglines for this, but this is today's tagline: successful ways of seeing project management. And the inspiration for this is a chap called Alan Kay, who was an early pioneer of computer science. Who was a pioneer of computer science, invented object-oriented programming. And something that he said was that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. And is that verifiable? No, it isn't. Is it an inspiration for this talk? Yes, it definitely is. Is IQ a good way of measuring intelligence? Probably not. But what he's really saying is that if you can find the right way of looking at something, then you can be much cleverer in the way that you solve the problem. And if so, the idea is that if you can find the right way of looking at something, you can become a genius, because 80 IQ points would make most of us genius level. But the opposite of that is that if you look at something in the wrong way, take 80 IQ points away, that would make most of us an idiot. So that the way that you look at things is very important. And for project management, this is extremely true. And one of the things, one of the big problems with project management is that there are a bunch of instinctive ways of looking at projects that people have that are extremely unhelpful, especially with software development as a thing to be project managed. There are a lot of things that are extremely unhelpful when you see them in that way, that we have to kind of try and avoid. And so the way I'm going to come at this is by suggesting some useful and helpful ways of looking at projects. But also at the end of these three talks, I'm going to do three talks today, 15 minutes each. At the end of those three talks, I will talk about unhelpful ways of looking at projects and possibly how to avoid those. So why now? Why do we need to be talking about this now? Well, we've had software development for around 75 years now, and the ability to genuinely manage it effectively is still kind of struggling. We're still struggling with that. And one of the real inspirations, again, I'm kind of mentioning landmarks, reasons that I've come to do this as I go along. One of the inspirations for this talk was reading an article by a chap called Mark Andreessen, who was involved in Netscape, which was one of the first commercial web browsers. It followed up on Mosaic. For those of you who weren't even born then, this is kind of like a predecessor to Chrome and Safari. And he's gone on to be involved in a company that invests in tech in Silicon Valley and in other places, and to think a lot of kind of good and big thoughts about what is happening in technology. And in 2010, as I said, he wrote an article where he talked about software eating everything. So what did he mean by software eating everything? What he meant was that software is getting into every aspect of our lives. So, for example, if you're interested in dating, or you're probably going to be using some kind of dating app these days. If you're interested in sex, you're probably going to be looking at some kind of porn site. If you want to watch the television, you're probably going to be doing that via some kind of software like Netflix. If you're interested in eating some food, you probably order it via Deliveroo or Uber Eats. If you're interested in traveling somewhere, you're probably going to do that via some kind of software, maybe via Uber. So that's the point that he's making, that software is eating all of our lives. And one of the things that's been happening just recently is like a huge debate about to what degree is AI software going to eat all our jobs as well. So being somebody who can deliver this kind of software, who can take ideas for software and then actually make them into realities. The kind of people who manage to do that are ruling the world. People like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, maybe. So that's the kind of justification for now, why we should be talking about this now. And that's the justification for why, when I've been handing out flyers for this, I've been saying, come and attend a short talk about how to rule the world, because this is an important life skill. If you can manage this, this is a very effective way of having some control over what goes on in the world. Why me? I've managed to do one actual professional show at the Edinburgh Fringe, and the rest of the time I've been talking on the meadows, and now I'm talking in my bedroom, although I plead illness for that. Why me? Because I've been managing projects now for about 15 years, and actually for about 25 years. My first project that I really managed was in 1998, and on and off since then, full time for the last 15 years. I manage projects for government departments, I manage projects for big commercial organisations, and I've also managed projects for small organisations. I've delivered a lot of projects, which is actually the kind of experience that it's actually quite difficult to find in people. Lots of people have been involved in projects. Very few people have taken projects right from the beginning right to the end. What else? Yeah, so that's the kind of boring reason why. I've been involved in IT since 1994. But there are some kind of less boring reasons why you should pay attention to me, I think. One of them is that I have, I think, not a radically different, but a different take on what constitutes successful project management, what sorts of things you should be doing. Yeah, so I'm not of the opinion that if you just follow the right kind of project management methodology, everything's going to be fine. I understand, and this is what I talk about a lot in this show, is I understand that there are a lot of difficulties involved, psychological difficulties, emotional difficulties in moving from the idea of a project to its reality. So why you? Why should you be interested in this? Well, I think there are a couple of different groups here. If you're involved in software development, then I think it's fairly straightforward that I think you should be interested in how to manage software development projects and projects in general. As I mentioned, that this is kind of becoming a vital skill for all sorts of organizations, being able to deliver software. And so if you're in one of those organizations that might need software, even if you're not actually someone involved in its development at all, then I think this will be useful as well. And then I think I'm going to make a really, really bold claim and say everybody else. I think everybody else should be interested in this, because what I'm talking about is how you go from a creative idea, an idea that something should exist, to the point where that thing actually does exist, and what sorts of tricks, what sorts of techniques, what sorts of ways of seeing things you should adopt, you could adopt to make that process more comfortable, more bearable, more successful. And I think that applies to just about everybody. Now, in order to explain my kind of theory about why delivering new projects, especially software development projects, is so difficult, I need to start off by talking about not new projects, not new products, but existing products. And I'm going to talk about some features of existing products and then set them off against what's actually going on in a new product in contrast. So I'm going to talk about cars in Japan, and specifically the Toyota Motor Company. Now, the Toyota Motor Company got started. It made some kind of other machinery in the 30s. I think sewing machines, possibly looms, and they thought that they would get into this the car manufacturing industry, and they went to visit. The Ford factory, which I think is in Indiana, or was in Indiana at the time, where they were making Model T Fords, and they saw this process of mass production. And their reaction to this was, because they knew the Japanese market very well, was to understand that they couldn't make cars in exactly the same way that Ford did. So Ford basically relied on the fact that the market in the United States was enormous. And so basically all of their focus was on making cars, as many cars as fast as possible. And there were economies of scale. The more they made, the cheaper they were. Toyota realized that this couldn't work for Japan, for two reasons. One, because the Japanese economy at the time was much, much smaller, and two, because it was very cyclical. So at some points there were like massive amounts of demand, and at other points there were very small amounts of demand. And so this started Toyota along the road of a process of focusing very much, that thing I talked about, demand, which when people look at Toyota and describe the way that Toyota makes cars, is called pull, which is the demand from the customer. So kind of like the way that Toyota make cars is oriented very much towards the pull that they have from the customer. Do they have a customer for this particular car? And the cars that are running down this production line with all the different options on them, possibly different models, are all triggered by a particular demand for a particular car. The other kind of thing that Toyota became very skilled at was understanding what aspects of this process of the production line were genuinely adding value, and which aspects of the process of the production line weren't adding value. So, for example, when the production line's not moving, no value is getting added, and so Toyota became very interested and very focused on making sure that the production line is continuing to be moving smoothly. One of the other things that they also realized was that having large amounts of parts hanging around the production line, all of those things that were hanging around that weren't getting added to cars and weren't adding value, those things were waste. They were kind of a waste of time. They were a waste of effort. And out of that kind of realization came something that you probably heard of, which is just-in-time manufacture. The idea that all of these things that go into the car, when something gets used, that triggers a request for something else to get delivered. And so that everything is kind of the request, the pull from the beginning of the production line starts all of these requests in train. Now, discussion of this process in Toyota has led to this idea of something called a value stream. And a value stream is a line at which, at different points along the line, different bits of value get added until it's ultimately consumed by a consumer, somebody who's producing the pull. And this idea of a value stream is something that I've used to contrast, or I am using now, to contrast between existing products and non-existing products. Because in an existing product, and it's important to understand how long it's taken Toyota to understand the product of cars, that this is now a 90-year-old production line that Toyota have. In existing products, there is this value stream. This is mature value stream. But the point that I want to make about non-existing products is that in non-existing products, there are two value streams. One which is weird, which is the idea value stream, and one which doesn't exist. And the whole business of managing a project for a new product is about managing the weird value stream, and as we'll see, there are problems with managing that weird value stream, and then starting to construct the value stream that doesn't exist. Because if you think about it, if you're trying to produce a new product, then that new product doesn't have any of those bits that are in this mature value stream that Toyota has for its cars. And so this is an important contrast to make between an existing value stream and the kind of value streams that you have when you're talking about a new non-existent product. So what we were talking about is the difference between the value streams on an existing product and the value streams on a new product that's been developed. That in an existing product, there's this one mature value stream where things get added, and probably work has been done to make sure that value gets added in the most efficient way possible, and it connects to to poll to the consumers, to the people who want to use this thing as efficiently as possible. So the problem that I was talking about was that in a non-existent product where you're having to develop the product, there are two different value streams. There's the idea value stream, which is kind of weird, and I'll talk why it's weird in a minute. And then there's the non-existent value stream that you have to build. And between those two is this kind of wilderness, which I'll talk about in a second. So let's talk first about this idea value stream. Why is it weird? Well, the idea value stream is weird very often because it's to the people who are trying to do the work of making this product happen, it's very opaque where this idea stream came from. So some things got put together, so kind of values got added together for somebody to decide that this is worth funding, this is worth putting some effort into and delivering. But very often where that has come from is kind of very opaque and very hidden. Also, often, the way that the idea value stream is put together is that it's got some kind of language around it that kind of encourages enthusiasm and discourages thought. So often it's got something like all, new technology, there's everything that the old system did, but better, faster, cheaper. It's got some kind of shiny language wrapping around it which encourages enthusiasm and funding and discourages actual detailed thought. Now, this is probably necessary, that kind of to wrap things in that kind of way to get an idea funded is probably necessary. But the issue with that is that when people start to kind of unpack that and trying to figure out what they actually need to put together to generate the value stream. So what things do we need to put together to deliver actual value to some users? The problem with that is then that they start to uncover difficulties. So let's say that, well, the example that I gave in the talk that I was talking about a couple of nights ago is if you've got an organisation that has got this idea that they want to do an ethical short-term loan, personal loan site. So that sounds great, but there are actually, once you start to try and put that together, there are actually some really fundamental problems with that. So the one that I worked on, there are some fundamental problems with the kind of people who use those kinds of systems, in that it's inherent in the nature of the kind of people who want to use that system that a substantial number of them won't be able to pay the money back. That means that you need to connect with a credit rating organisation. In this organisation that I work for, connecting with that credit rating organisation, it turns out their software wasn't very good, and so that was a problem that we had to deal with. But also there was another problem, which was that if you start lending money to people, then you get to be regulated by the government. And the people who were adopting a kind of move fast and break things attitude to getting this thing done hadn't filled in those forms, and those forms take about 6 months to fill in. So that's a real life example of kind of the things that happen when you start to actually implement something. Once you start to unpack an idea, you start to take the shine off it. Once you start to try and figure out how do we connect things together to actually generate the value that's talked about in the idea, you start to undermine the idea. And this is this kind of wilderness that you're in. And one of the things that's weird about this wilderness is that it's the place that you spend most of your time on most projects, in a place where you are struggling to really understand what the idea means, and by trying to understand it and by trying to implement it, you're undermining the idea, and then by undermining the idea, you're undermining the people who've taken responsibility for the idea, the people who funded the idea. So you're in this kind of extremely difficult situation very often for substantial amounts of time throughout a project. Now, one of the things that I'm going to talk about, kind of good ways of looking at this in a second. But one of the things that kind of I have talked about in the past with this is that what you should try and do is to try and get out of that wilderness as fast as possible. And there are some strategies that you can use to try and get out of that wilderness as fast as possible. But I think by talking about it like that, I may be kind of soft playing the fact that for a lot of projects, you're going to end up spending a lot of time in this kind of wilderness. I used to call it a desert. I've started to call it a wilderness because I also talk about a swamp, and I'm going to talk about a swamp in just a minute. So this is the challenge of projects, and sometimes this is called the Valley of Despair. Other people talk about it. It's talked about in relation to other kinds of related ideas. There's the notion of crossing the chasm for project innovation. I'm not saying I'm the first person to talk about this, but what's interesting is that if you pick up most books about project management, if you listen to most people talk about project management, especially project management for software development, you won't hear much mention of this wilderness, of this difficult place that you're in, where the challenges that you have are that you need to start assembling. You don't have a value stream. So one of the ways that people can kind of wrong foot you in this space is to pretend that what you're doing is not product development, but product production, like car manufacture. No, you're doing product development. It's a different thing. You don't have that existing value stream. So I'm going to talk now about 1, 2, 3, 4 different good ways of seeing things that can help you when you're in this wilderness. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is a bet. This is an important thing to understand about any project. That it's a bet. It's a bet that doing certain actions, making certain things, outlying certain expenditure will result in a positive payoff. Now, that might not be money, because if you're doing this for the government, the payoff might be in the government managing to implement successfully its legislation. The payoff might be in happy citizens. The payoff might be in money if it's a tax-raising application, but there are lots of different kinds of value that can happen. But still, it's important to understand that every project is a bet. And part of that, which is a kind of realization that I had a long time ago, and I haven't really talked about very clearly, is that there may be quite a lot of theatre making it look like the decision to fund this project and go with it in a certain way is reasoned. But there is this kind of thing, there's a chap called Herb Simon talks about, which is bounded rationality. And the point here is that for most real life complex problems, you can only think about them so far. And then you have to decide, okay, we've done enough thinking, we're going to have to either go for it or not go for it. And the way that I've kind of explained this to myself is that sooner or later, somebody has to say, fuck it. Sooner or later, somebody has to say, you know what, fuck it, let's just have a go at this. And on any project that you're working on and trying to deliver, no matter how much people have pretended that this is a rational endeavor and it's straightforward and simple and there are no risks involved, that is exactly what has happened. Somebody has taken a bet. Somebody is saying, fuck it. My note to myself when I gave this talk in front of a real audience on Monday was that I shouldn't swear, but I think that's the one time when I will swear. So that's the bet aspect. The other aspect, and this is why I've started to call this a wilderness and not a desert. When you're in this wilderness, one of the things that you can recognize to make life easier for you and to make chances of the project succeeding much better are that you're in a swamp. You're in a complex space. What do I mean by a swamp? Well, I mean a place that has lots and lots of different kinds of inhabitants. It has fauna, it has flora, it has things that are native to that environment that you're trying to do this project in. It has probably inhabitants, so it's got people who are already inhabiting this problem space without the thing that you're making. And it might have people who want to come and inhabit this problem space after you've done this thing. So there are all sorts of people who are interested. It's a complex space. And beyond that, there are other people who might not inhabit this swamp, not the fauna, not the flowers, not the flora, not the flowers, not the fauna, not the snakes or newts or whatever it is that kind of are inhabiting this space. There are people who are paying for you to do things in this space. And then there also might be other people. You remember I talked about with the personal loan example, regulators. So there are other people who've never been to this swamp, never want to come to this swamp, but still care and have influence over this swamp. So this extremely complicated environment that you're doing your project in. And acknowledging that this is an extremely complicated environment means that you can start to do two things. One is explore. So one of the classic ways of exploring in user research, one of the classic ways of exploring in software development is user research. So talking to the people who might use your product in this complex environment, talking to people who are already in this complex environment, understanding their problems, their fears, failures, and frustrations. That's part of it. But also beyond users, coming up with strategies for provoking, eliciting opinions, getting input from all those other people who are related to that complex area, who aren't necessarily users. Now, for some people, this might sound like heresy, that the only people that we should be interested in are the users. But there are all these other people connected to that environment, like regulators, like the people who are funding it. And one of the ways that you can do this is by starting to generate things that work. So starting to assemble things that show some of the value, and then starting to demonstrate those to as many people as you can who are connected with this complex environment. Now, obviously, that then presents somebody with some decisions, because in this complex environment, you then have to craft how you're going to react to all these things. So, like, it makes it extremely complicated you start to reveal a lot of the complication of that environment by doing this stuff. That thing that I'm talking about, constructing working software, is I talk about that as a separate idea, which is the idea of escape. So what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to get out of this wilderness eventually, and the way to get out of this wilderness is to connect to pull. So connect to people who want the thing that you're creating. Like in the Toyota example, people who want cars were kind of notionally waiting on the end of the production line. Try and connect what you're doing and the value that you're creating to people who actually want this thing. Now, the important thing to understand is that it's not quite like the Toyota example, because getting things any of the way down the conveyor belt, connecting any of the things together to create some kind of value is better than nothing at all. And that's because ultimately you want to get to the outside world. You want to connect to real people in the outside world. But very often, as part of being in this wilderness, there are all sorts of things that are stopping you. It's like being in a prison camp. There's barbed wire, and then beyond the barbed wire there are dogs, and then beyond the dogs there is a moat, and etc., etc. So there are all these different things that you have to get through in order to actually get to the outside. And there's a temptation, if you realise that you can't escape, to think, I'll just give up then. But what you really need to do is to try and get as far as you can, and as near as you can to the outside. And one of the benefits of doing this, of course, is that by showing this stuff to residents of the swamp, potential residents of the swamp, regulators of the swamp, etc., you can then find out more. Your map of what is going on in the swamp gets more and more rich and detailed. And I've got two other things that I want to talk about, which are the pirate ship, and Zen in the art of archery, and I'm going to do that in the next bit. So we talked briefly about escape and the importance of getting things out from the wilderness, connecting with real users, even if that's a small thing, and also, like, even if you can't get all the way to the end, digging a tunnel through some of the fences and some of the through under some of the walls is still better than nothing, which is kind of not the same as in a real escape, because it gives you a chance at some point to get nearer the outside world. I'm going to just talk about two other positive ways of seeing, and then I'm going to talk about a few bad ways of seeing projects that might not necessarily be so helpful. The first one of these is, I've talked about here, is the pirate ship. So this is basically an idea that I get. It's inspired by the amazing improvisational theatre innovator and thinker Keith Johnston. And I think it's in his book Impro for Storytelling, but it might be in his other book that's just called Impro. He talks about this danger with especially new and inexperienced improvisers of them coming up with something which is what he calls agreed activity, which is something that they're doing which looks like activity but is actually a very low risk thing, and is not really, in terms of improvisation, advancing the story. And the way that I explain this to myself is that if you have an improvised scene that's on the deck of a ship, and you have, like, say, 4 improvisers who are on the deck of a ship, and one of the improvisers puts a telescope to their eye. It's an imaginary telescope, and they put it to their eye, and they look to the horizon, and they say, "Oh, look, a pirate ship." Then from that moment onwards, there's a lot of discussion in improvisation about what the expectation of the audience is. From that moment onwards, the expectation of the audience is that those improvisers will somehow encounter this pirate ship, that the pirate ship will come closer and closer and closer, and the improvisers will deal with it. But there's this kind of alternative urge within the people who are on the stage that somebody might say, well, let's scrub the decks, let's make the ship nice and clean. And for the improvisers, there's a temptation to go with that. There's a temptation to go with this safe activity that isn't advancing the story, that is not making, that is not interesting for the audience. And something like this happens in projects if you're not careful. That there's a way of kind of engaging with products which looks like activity but is actually safe. It's not pointing out any of those problems that I talked about with the idea. It's not saying, well, actually, this technology that was one of the reasons why you wanted to do this project, we've started to use it and it's highly problematic for various reasons. It's not engaging with any of the problems, but it still looks like activity. It's kind of agreed activity. And one of the really intriguing things about this kind of activity in improvisation is that very often the improvisers on the stage, they manage to agree on this without any kind of discussion, or with an absolute minimal discussion. And it's the same in projects, that teams manage to agree on doing something that doesn't actually rock the boat, that doesn't cause any problems, that doesn't challenge or undermine the existing idea. And very often when you go into projects, if you're asked to go and help projects, there are problems, or the equivalent of the pirate ship. There is something that's kind of hovering on the horizon that everybody on the project knows is a problem, but he's not saying, especially not saying to senior management. They're not rocking the boat. And this is the reason that the project is not making any progress forward. So one of the ways that you can make sure that you progress through this kind of wilderness in the middle of a project is that when you identify problems, you actually call them out and you address them, either as a team, if you can address them as a team, or you escalate them outside of the team. You make sure that people know about them so that they get tackled. Now, one of the final things, and this is something that I've just kind of thought of just recently as an idea, is, and I've written down here, Zen in the art of archery. So one of the challenges that people might make to the kinds of things that I would be advising that people do all the way through this wilderness is a bunch of activities, a bunch of kind of these are activities that have got agile names like stand up and retrospective and show and tell and planning. Seems to be some argument about exactly what the show and tell meeting should be called, but I'm not going to get into that at this point. These are kind of meetings that kind of, my suggestion would be that you keep having these all the way through the time that you're in the wilderness. And then some people might say, well, what's the difference between that and agreed activity? That sounds a lot like agreed activity. And I think the difference is tension. The amount of tension that is involved in having these kinds of meetings. And this is because of a quote from a book, Zen and the Art of Archery. And one of the things that it talks about the kind of like, the absolute kind of peak after many years of struggle, where the author of the book starts to get what is involved in being an archer in the Zen way, is this idea of remaining comfortable in the state of highest tension. So I think one of the things that we instinctively do is that we try to avoid tension. We try to kind of make things as low tension as possible. And one of the things that kind of the productive way through the wilderness is actually to remain in a reasonably high state of tension, and that's basically because you're arbitrating, you're kind of negotiating between the idea and the aims and goals and hopes and dreams of the people who had the idea, very often which are unreasonable, and what can actually be done. And one way to kind of solve that problem is to use the kind of agreed activity that I just talked about with relation to the pirate ship, is to just do something that looks like activity, but which is not actually throwing up any of these difficulties. Another way is to just try and torpedo the whole business, is to just say, and I think I've been guilty of this sometimes in the past, is to just say, there's no way this is going to happen. There are these fundamental problems which mean this is not going to happen at all. There are these fundamental show-stopping problems. This is not going to happen. And this, in a way, is an attempt to resolve this tension that there is in any project between the idea and the things that need to be done to start to realize the idea. And what I've started to realize just recently is that what you really need to be doing when you're in this kind of wilderness, yes, sometimes you will be able to connect something to the outside world and be able to generate some real pull, and that will completely change the dynamic of a project. But a lot of time you will just be in this tension. You will be in this tension between the idea and the hopes, dreams, and expectations of the idea about what can be delivered and at what kind of time and with what kind of performance, and the reality of what can be delivered within what kind of time and what kind of performance. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to remain comfortable, non-hysterical, non-damaging to yourself, and non-damaging to the other people that you're working for in this tension. And that is extremely difficult. It's also extremely difficult if you don't realize. It's even more difficult if you don't realize that's what you're supposed to be doing. Because if you don't realize that's what you're supposed to be doing, then you will beat yourself up for being in this tension. You will beat yourself up for not being comfortable with where you are, for not breaking yourself. There's very often this response from the people who had the idea that, the response to the difficulties should be that the team that are working on this should work ridiculously hard. They should kind of be looking stressed. They should be working long hours. They should be hurting themselves. You need to be comfortable with the idea that that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You also need to be comfortable with the idea that you shouldn't just ignore these problems and go back to doing some kind of agreed activity. So this is an idea, this remaining comfortable in the state of highest tension. And that's a kind of German telling of a Japanese Zen idea. But also kind of just recently I've come across a notion by the amazing English poet who died tragically at the age of 26, John Keats, where he briefly talks about this in one of his letters. He talks about creativity being about a negative capability, which is something like an ability to suspend disbelief, and an ability, and I think that is possibly a kind of genuine optimism. People talk about kind of pessimistic optimists or cheerful pessimists. They combine these things rather than being kind of a blanket optimist. This is kind of a willingness to not kind of just throw the whole thing out because there are problems with it, and a willingness also to not just kind of fold your arms and stop worrying about it and pretend to do things, but something in between, some kind of like virtuous way of engaging with this and creating some kind of tension and maintaining comfort in that kind of tension. That's brand new stuff, and I'm very happy with it, but we'll see where it goes in the final talk. So in the last few minutes, I'm just going to talk about bad ways of seeing that are really unhelpful, but I don't think you're ever going to completely get away from these ideas of seeing, and these ways of seeing which are unhelpful for projects. The first of these is promise. The idea that in development of something new, the structure of the project is that the people who are doing the work are somehow on a promise. They've been committed to something, and that if they can't deliver the thing that they've committed to deliver, then they are bad people. And if what they're committing to deliver is taking longer and costing more than they initially said, then they should be working harder. They should be self-harming in order to do that. This is extremely common. And one of the things that I've noticed about this comes from the fact. I'll mention the book in the notes for this. There's a chapter about it in a book by Robert Cialdini. This notion of commitment and consistency, that we all want to keep our promises. We want to be consistent with our statements about what we're going to do. This is a powerful human urge. But one of the things I've noticed about it when it is connected with project management is that it's almost always what I call commitment and consistency jujitsu. It's basically, well, you committed to this thing, and so technically that means you also committed to this thing, and even though you didn't know about this thing, this means you've committed to this thing. Or even, and this is kind of the worst kind of commitment and consistency jujitsu, I've committed to it, so you've committed to it. In general, I think that those kinds of commitments to delivering certain things on certain days, etc., when so many things are unknown, are extremely harmful and dangerous. What I do think is useful, if you can extract this commitment from people, because commitment and consistency is a powerful idea, what I do think is useful is getting people to commit to addressing the pirate ships when they come up. Getting people to commit to being prepared to discuss risks and issues as they emerge. That's actually an extremely powerful and useful way of using commitment and consistency. Connected to commitment and consistency, all of these things I think in some way are connected to each other, is the idea that work is work. This is basically an either willful or innocent belief that the kind of work that's involved in developing complex projects, especially things like software development, is just like other kinds of work. It's just like kind of moving things from one place to another, or shoveling things, or kind of assembling widgets. That it's just all the work involved is the same, and if we go faster, we'll get more work done. I'll talk about faster in a minute. This completely hides the fact of all the things that we've been talking about it being a bet, where possibly there's an uncertain understanding of the payoff, about bounded rationality, that sooner or later somebody has to say fuck it, and about it being a swamp, about it being a complex interaction between all of these different things and the environment. So very often, the people who are saying to you, well, this is just a matter of you going faster, this is just a matter of your developers typing faster, and then we can get this thing finished on time, they will be very cognizant of things like regulatory frameworks that at some point are going to completely stymie what you're doing, or some other kind of complexity, other kinds of politics inside the organization. They're going to slow things down, that are going to dependencies that they've not told you about. So very often, again, this idea that work is actually quite disingenuous. The people who are involved in it, in pushing this, like with the idea of commitment and consistency, are not being straightforward with you. Connected with that is the idea that going faster is just straightforwardly better. And I was talking to somebody about this just recently, and I said, well, let's take the example of if we're in traffic and I'm driving and you're saying to me, can we go faster? How can we go faster? What can we do to go faster? Can we go faster? We need to go faster. Can we go faster? Is this helpful? Is this useful? No, it isn't. So there might be things that we might be able to do to avoid traffic. There might not. But just focusing on the going faster is not really helping at all. A very useful thing to do in many situations is to really take notice of how long something actually takes you given traffic. And then that will be the time that you can predict in future circumstances that's a likely time that it will take you in the future. And then finally, well, just one more thing about going faster. Even if you're on an open road and you don't have any traffic in front of you, do you just go as fast as you can? Is that safe? Is that sensible? Is there any damage that you can do to yourself or your environment or your vehicle? If you think vehicle might be company or team, there are other reasons why you might not want to go absolutely as fast as you can. So fast is not a terrifically useful measure in very many situations inside a product. And then finally, I'm running way over time with this third video today. Completeness. This comes back to the idea of a promise that what project management is about, even in complex product development spaces with new things, is about delivering on a specific list of things. And completeness can cause huge problems if you're not careful earlier on in a project, because people can set things up in such a way that they won't move on until the next stage of a project, until something is complete. I've seen this completely stimmy projects, that they won't move to the point where they start doing development until all of the requirements are complete. I've seen this completely threatened stimmy projects that are notionally done in an agile way, that we can't start the development until the design is complete. We can't start the development until the list of user requirements is complete. This is a completely, I'm using the word, this is a very dangerous way of thinking about things. It's much better to think about things in terms of partiality. What is the most partial thing that we can get all the way to the outside to connect with users? If you remember this idea of escape. And in another video, I'll talk about this thing called the turding point, which I'm not going to talk about today. So that's enough from me. I'm still struggling with this cold. Ta-ra!